I got involved in all this when Occupy movement started. So Occupy Vancouver in October of 2011 when it was mentioned, I saw it. I've been watching Occupy Wall Street. I found it very interesting. And I started looking for a solution that we could have for the world, because I like solutions, not just complaining about the world. And I found the idea of take corporate money out of politics. Great platform, I thought, for Occupy. I took this into Joyce Murray, who's a Liberal MP in my area, and I said, Joyce Murray, would you like to support this idea of taking corporate money out of politics? I actually sent it to every MP in British Columbia, and she responded. And she said, yes, I'll support you. I went to the first day of Occupy and I gave a speech explaining what's happening and the idea of taking corporate money out of politics. Had some conversations afterwards, and this is where things started falling apart. First was, you can't just take corporate money out of politics, you need to take union money out of politics. That made many people upset. But the main point where I noticed something was wrong was in the preparations for Occupy Vancouver, when people started promoting violence. Black bloc style violence, so what we saw during the G20 in Toronto and the Olympics in Vancouver, and starting from Seattle in 1999, the WTO. And people were promoting the concept that we need to consider violence. They shared a video that you can probably share here with Harsha Walia of No One Is Illegal Vancouver. And that video, it was her debating a man named Derek O'Keefe, who was a writer for Rabble up until recently, over should we be allowing violence in protest. It was right after they smashed the windows of the Hudson Bay in Vancouver, and he spoke against it, and Harsha Walia was promoting violence, saying the people who were in the Black Bloc were actually heroes. She said the people who de-arrest their colleagues from the police, meaning someone gets arrested and you grab them back and get a physical fight with the police, were heroes. When that video was released, people in Occupy Vancouver, many of them freaked out. We weren't supposed to be violent. Occupy was not a violent movement. And there was a debate that was started. It was a few people involved, but I stepped in on it. It was mainly Min Rice, who's a blogger, and she was once labeled as the most popular CDN poly blogger in Canada. But she spoke out about the violence, and she said, we can't have violence. I came in to back her and say we can't have violence, and the debate began at Occupy Vancouver. This was a week before we set up our tents. Okay. And from that point I realized there's something seriously wrong inside of activist movements in Canada. I started to notice, well, first very early on we noticed CUPE gave us a $20,000 donation.
Who?
CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees.
Okay.
They gave us $20,000. So the money was going to people who were in the existing activist community, who weren't sharing any of the reporting on the money, and who weren't having finance committee meetings. So we noticed immediately there was a problem with money. We had collection jars at either end of the camp, big, large water bottles filled with cash, and no one knows where it went. But then we started noticing little things happening. I was on a committee at Occupy Vancouver, which was the policy committee, which we set up on the first planning day that we would have. When it came for Occupy to start, Harsha Walia and I were on this committee, and all of a sudden the committee was cancelled. No one explained who cancelled the committee. There was no vote inside of the General Assembly about stopping or changing committees. It just changed. And so we noticed that there were separate powers inside of Occupy very early on, but in Vancouver I don't think it was as obvious to me as it was when I arrived in Toronto. I was very new to the community, so it was quite a learning experience to understand the history behind these things. I showed up for an Occupy Toronto direct action meeting. The direct action is where you go on the streets and you either block traffic or do some sort of event that's disruptive. In the meeting was Dave Vasey, who we found out later is the leader of Occupy Toronto. Dave works with also the Christian Peacemaker team. He seems a bit of a Christian anarchist. Lana Goldberg, who was in the Direct Action Committee, and Lana Goldberg works with the Ontario Common Front and with unions. So whenever you see a union event, it's her. and a few other occupiers. And I sat down there, and one of the people who was the marshals, I forget his name now, but he went up to Dave Vasey about 15 minutes after I was there with his BlackBerry. And then they all looked at me, and all of a sudden everything changed.
Oh, it's like they figured out who you were, you think?
They figured out who I was. They were waiting for me. They were expecting me. But I found like I was being tracked wherever I went anyway. Right after Occupy Vancouver, I went to live in Cortes Island in BC. It was a small remote island at a resort named Hollyhock. Hollyhock is led by the Tides Foundation. It was founded by one of the members of Greenpeace. I got there because I found an ad in Craigslist, if you want a place to stay, and I thought it said Hollyhock. I thought it was rather secluded and interesting, but also I had my concerns about foundations, and this was the training headquarters for one of the foundations, so I thought it was a good place to go. But when I arrived at Cortes Island, I found that someone from Occupy had sent mails to 50 people on the island saying that I'm dangerous and mentally ill.
Wow.
So they viewed me as a threat when I got to Cortes. When I arrived in Toronto, they viewed me as a threat. And they immediately separated the groups and pushed me into another group. And that day, I just felt something was wrong. But I also looked at Dave Vasey's computer. Dave Vasey's computer said on it Ruckus Society. And the Ruckus Society is a NGO based out of the US for training activists. It's been funded by Tides. I think it's been funded by the Ford Foundation and other foundations. And the Ruckus Society was one of the organizations responsible for the violence during the Seattle WTO in 1999. So as soon as I saw that, I knew something was happening in the reactions. Then I met in Toronto some other people who had been involved in Occupy, and they started giving me the inside information on who's who and who was running things. And I think the people at Occupy Toronto who were seeing problems saw them a lot more clearly than the people in Vancouver did. There were people at Occupy Toronto who showed up on day one knowing that there were foundations behind this and knowing that there's falsities. So I'll admit I was a little bit slow on this in Vancouver, and all of Vancouver was a little slow on this. But then as soon as I got here, I noticed that on the first incident.
So you're saying these foundations were indeed funding the violence within the Occupy action events?
I wouldn't.
In a sense?
No foundation has ever openly or publicly funded violence, but the foundations have funded organizations that have enabled violence. Everything about the Ruckus Society is a direct action training organization. And every major violent protest, there have been Ruckus Society members there. I don't think all Ruckus Society members are committing violence, but they're certainly part of the pack. When you look at the G20, or you look at the what happened in I think it's 1997 Republican Convention in Chicago, the way they use the crowds for the Black Bloc actions to happen, you can't smash up the city in a Black Bloc unless you have 20,000 people surrounding it, because you'll never get away with it. So Occupy is one of those events where the people who are on the anarchist side, or the people who believe in the need for violence, or the people who just accept the need for violence, were able to gather thousands of people together, but not enough. Right? If you look at how many people showed up to Occupy Toronto, there weren't really enough like the G20 to get away with it. If you look at the G20, they brought out the union members, they brought out the activists, and they brought out NGOs, and they all marched together, and right in the middle were the people who commit the violence, the Black Bloc.
Yeah.
And in Toronto, if you look at the pictures of the Black Bloc, standing in front of them was known as illegal, including Harsha Walia from Known as Illegal Vancouver, and her husband Harjap Grul, I never pronounced his name properly, from Known as Legal Vancouver and from the Council Canadians. So when the violence happened in Toronto, you have the Black Bloc guys shielded by Known as Illegal, and Known as Illegal puts a couple of Indigenous people in front. They put a person in a wheelchair. They put people who the police would not want to interfere because it would be very bad PR. and then the Black Bloc break out.
So you think it was all by design, eh?
It is, and they didn't do this in the G20, but in the Republican convention in Chicago, they gave people colors. And so one color was like green, and it's never arrest me. Another color was orange, which was, I don't mind being too close to the arrestable people. And the other one is the last color, I think it was red, which was, I'm getting arrested. And they made layers of people. One member of Occupy Toronto told me they did the color system for one of the Occupy protests also. So the only way that this political violence can happen and people can get away with it is if they have a crowd.
Okay, so you were talking about foundations funding, Occupy, like Ruckus and stuff. Like, what connections did you make by these foundations, like following the money trail further? You want to touch down on that?
Yeah, okay. I started looking at this, I had my hint that foundations were involved. I'll say that I don't know of any NGO funding Occupy other than the Council of Canadians. The Council of Canadians is led by a woman named Maud Barlow, who's a very well-known globalist. Maud Barlow promotes the idea of a one-world parliament in the United Nations.
Is she part of the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
She promotes that. It's her. In Canada, we have herself, Elizabeth May.
Trudeau.
I don't see Trudeau on the list.
Yeah,
Is he? Okay, and Chow is on the list. And in fact, I was just going through the list last week. I've written about all these people. I didn't know they're part of an organization until I got to it. But so I started looking at the foundation money going to the individual activists. So you look at Dave Vasey, for example, when I arrived. He was saying, I am completely grassroots, I always work alone, I don't have foundation money. But then you look, he worked with the Rainforest Action Network, which is funded by Tides and all the same groups. And then I looked at Secura Saunders, who is one of the leaders of Occupy Toronto. And she'd previously worked with organizations, including Prometheus Radio, which was funded through Ford Foundation. She was previously with Corp Watch, which is funded by Soros Open Society Foundation. And you start looking at all the individual activists and how they're funded by the foundations. At first, they absolutely denied this. Even 2 weeks ago, Ezra Levant at Sun News was interviewing Secura Saunders, who's following him around. He said, so where do you get your money, Secura? And he said, do you get your money from Tides Foundation? She didn't say a word. But then, where are you getting your money? And she didn't. I live in a basement with my in-laws. And it turns out she didn't live in a basement with her in-laws. The week before, she announced she moved to Ottawa. And she's working with the People's Social Forum, which is the Canadian element of an organization called the World Social Forum. If you look at the website for the People's Social Forum, they pay $50,000 a year. So you start realizing that the professional activists are getting funding or support. But then we found the connection of many of these professional activists across the country all share the same tattoo.
Really?
It says, love is the movement.
Okay.
Dave Vasey's Love is the Movement, I think, is here. We have a number of main activists. I don't go through the list. Dave Vasey of Occupy Toronto has a Love is a Movement tattoo. Taylor Fluke of Occupy Toronto had the Love is the Movement tattoo. Chelsea Fluke of Occupy Edmonton, the leader of Occupy Edmonton, had the Love is the Movement tattoo. And we move on to another of other people who are involved in Occupy, including Clayton Thomas Mueller of the Indigenous Environmental Network. The IEN is funded by Tides, and Clayton leads a lot of the Indigenous movement.
Okay.
And many of these people have the same tattoo. And Ariel Derringer is the last one to mention. Ariel Derringer is with the Athabasca First Nation, Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. And she was one of the primary people involved in the Neil Young tour against the oil sands across the country. She's been to Hollyhock. You start taking the list of who's getting money from Tides, and then you start looking at the activists who are going to Tides training camp at Hollyhock. And the Love This Movement group have direct connections to Hollyhock. And they all spend enormous amounts of time saying, we have no money from foundations. But they are supported all the way through. Tides brings in, the last few years, I think, $400 million into Canada, all for activism. Tides Foundation was initially based in the US, and they're based out of San Francisco.
Yeah.
They're what many people call a money laundering organization. Is Tides takes donations from people and then puts out money to other NGOs or other organizations. So Tides right now, the foundation, the US version, gets their money from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Pew Foundation, from the Hewlett Foundation, Packard Foundation, and Moore Foundation, more of Intel. Just a few of the main donors. But let's look at the list of these people donating the money here. Rockefeller Foundation is funded by the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller family made all their money by creating Standard Oil. Rockefeller himself, one of the ways he got rich was by inventing the phrase pipeline politics. So Rockefeller would buy a refinery over here, and then he would, he'd try to buy the refinery over here, but the refinery wouldn't sell or they want too much money. So he ended up buying the plot of land that the pipeline goes through. And then he cuts off the pipeline and says, ha, your refinery is worthless. So now we will buy you for cheap. So manipulation of systems for pipelines was Rockefeller's business. He invented it. The Pew Foundation. The Pew family comes from the Sunoco Oil, which was one of the oil companies that worked with Rockefeller in big oil powers. This is a lot of research that came out of Vivian Krause with the Financial Post. Was that the people who are leading the fight against Canadian industry are American oil barons. So Tides is very well funded by the established rich left American. And the Soros actually Foundation also gives them money. In Canada, Tides set up Tides Canada. Tides Canada is a separate separate organization. But here's how the money works. If you're a billionaire who wants to stop Canadian oil projects, you will give money to Tides Foundation. Tides Foundation will give that money in an account to Tides Canada, and Tides Canada will send that money out to whoever is protesting the Canadian industry. So here we have a very non-transparent way of moving money to fund the activist world. So my view of what's happening is that individual Canadians are losing their power to foreign influencers, which is just not right. Maybe some of the things I agree with. Actually, I do agree with many of the things Tides does and other foundations do, and the environmental movement does. There are many good, positive things. Do we need to make sure that tailings ponds in the oil sands are not killing birds? Absolutely. So the first person to complain about it, bring it up and help us get better, that's a positive thing. But their ultimate goal is a question. Why are foreign oil baron family foundations funding to stop Canadian oil? It's all very curious.